Welcome back for another deep dive. So you guys gave us this guide about assessing credibility in refugee claims.
Mm-hmm.
It's from IRB Legal Services.
Okay.
And it's dated December 31st, 2020.
All right.
So we're going to take a look at that.
It must be interesting.
Yeah, it looks at how credibility is judged
Mm-hmm.
in these refugee protection claims.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really fascinating stuff, you know. It's not just about catching someone in a lie.
Right.
It's about so much more.
It goes so much deeper than that.
Yeah.
It's really looking at all the nuances of evidence and the context of someone's story.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about people who have fled incredibly difficult situations, you know?
Right.
And this guide acknowledges that that experience can really affect how they tell their stories.
Yeah, and it talks about things like hearsay evidence.
Okay.
Yeah, you might think, well, if it's hearsay, if it's secondhand information,
Right.
that's automatically bad news. But it's not so simple.
No, not at all. In a refugee claim, someone might be relying on what others have told them about the situation back home.
Mm-hmm.
They might not have official documents or be able to safely gather proof.
Right.
So just dismissing that out of hand wouldn't be fair at all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially given the challenges that refugees face in fleeing their countries and coming to a new country. So the guide emphasizes
Right.
that the decision makers have to really look at the reliability of hearsay.
Okay.
You know, like who said it,
Right.
why they said it,
Mm-hmm.
what were the circumstances,
Yeah.
and they can't just throw it out without considering those things.
Yeah, exactly. They have to look at the bigger picture.
Right.
And that brings us to another really important point,
Okay.
which is the danger of assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes even a small assumption can totally derail a whole case.
Yeah.
And the guide actually gives an example of this with a case called Muhammad v. Canada, where the decision maker made the wrong assumption about the order of events in a document. And that led to this really unreasonable conclusion.
Wow. So
Yeah.
they're looking at this document, they're trying to piece together the story,
Mm-hmm.
but they make one little assumption,
Right.
and that throws the whole thing off.
It can have a huge impact on the outcome.
Wow.
So decision makers have to be really careful
Mm-hmm.
about not jumping to conclusions. Even if something seems a little off at first,
Right.
they have to dig deeper and see if the evidence really backs up their impression.
Yeah, it's like solving a puzzle, right?
Exactly.
You have all these pieces, and you got to figure out how they fit together.
You got it.
You can't just force them
Right.
into place. Now, let's talk about this idea of
Okay.
the presumption of truthfulness.
Yeah, this is a big one.
Yeah, I know it basically means that we generally believe someone is telling the truth,
Mm-hmm.
unless we have a good reason to doubt them.
Right, right.
But how does that actually work in these complicated refugee cases?
Well, the guide actually highlights a case called Maldonado that established this principle.
In Canadian law, but it also makes it clear that the strength of that presumption can vary from case to case.
So it's not just this blanket rule.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Okay. So are there times then
Yeah.
when a claimant's story might be met with more skepticism from the start?
Yeah, it depends.
Okay.
The guide really emphasizes that this presumption applies to the facts
Okay.
that are presented, not the claimant's interpretation of those facts.
Mm-hmm.
There's this other case, Hernandez, that really clarifies this.
Okay.
It basically says, okay, we can accept that these facts are true,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't have to accept the conclusions that the claimant is drawing from those facts.
Oh, I see. So if someone says, I saw soldiers raiding houses,
Right.
that's a fact.
That's a fact.
But if they then say, this means they were targeting me specifically,
Right.
that's an interpretation.
Exactly. That's where you need more evidence.
You need more evidence.
Okay, that makes sense. And speaking of evidence, another really crucial element in all these cases is understanding the situation
Mm-hmm.
in the claimant's home country.
Right.
The guide calls this country conditions evidence.
Exactly.
So this is where we go beyond the individual story
Mm-hmm.
and we look at the bigger picture.
The broader context.
Right, like is what they're saying actually happening in that country?
Exactly. Decision makers have to look at things like reports from human rights organizations,
Okay.
news articles,
Yeah.
expert testimony. It's about putting that claimant's story into context and seeing if their fear of persecution is objectively reasonable,
Okay.
given what we know about the situation in their country.
So it's almost like you're fact-checking their story
In a way, yes.
against this broader political and social landscape.
Exactly.
And I imagine that gets really tricky
It
when
can.
you're dealing with claims that are based on things like religion or political opinion.
Absolutely. The decision maker can't just rely on their own assumptions
Right.
or limited knowledge. They need to consult credible sources and develop this really nuanced understanding of the specific risks that people are facing in that country.
So you might need to become like an expert.
Yeah, in a way.
On religious minorities in a particular region or the treatment of political dissidents under a certain regime.
It's a lot to take in.
That is a lot of information to process.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important for decision makers to have access to really reliable, up-to-date information about those country conditions, because that evidence helps to ensure that these credibility assessments are grounded in fact, not stereotypes or unfounded beliefs.
Right. Now, this leads us to another principle that I think is really important, the benefit of the doubt.
Right. This is a crucial one.
So this principle comes into play when a claimant's story is generally consistent with what we know about the facts and the evidence.
Yeah.
Even if there might be some pieces missing or details that aren't totally clear.
Exactly.
So if their story basically lines up with what we know about the situation, we should lean towards believing them.
Yeah.
Even if there are some gaps.
You got it.
Okay. Now, there's this landmark Supreme Court decision that really looked at how to apply this principle.
Right.
And it's interesting because the majority of the court said, hey, if the claimant's allegations directly contradict the evidence, then we can't just give them the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
But then the dissenting judges were like, no, the benefit of the doubt should be applied.
Interesting.
If the claimant's story lines up with how certain policies or practices were actually implemented in their country.
So there's some debate, even within the highest court.
Yeah, so even within the Supreme Court, there are these different opinions on how to actually apply this.
It's tricky.
Yeah, it's tricky. And it highlights how difficult this balancing act can be.
Right.
Between being fair to the individual and making sure the system isn't being taken advantage of.
Absolutely. And speaking of fairness, that brings us to the concept of natural justice.
Okay, so natural justice.
Yeah.
It's not just about following the letter of the law.
Right.
It's about making sure the whole process is actually fair.
Exactly. Fairness has to be at the forefront of the entire process.
Okay.
And the guide uses a case called Velothar to illustrate this.
Okay.
So in Velothar, the decision maker basically made the claimants think that their credibility wasn't an issue.
Okay.
But then suddenly they rejected the claim based on credibility. And the court was like, whoa, that's not okay.
Yeah.
You can't just spring that on them at the last minute.
Right.
They have to have a chance to respond to those concerns.
Yeah, that does seem...
It's a big no-no.
Yeah, it's a big no-no. It's like a violation of fairness. It's like you're playing a game.
Right.
And the rules change in the middle.
Yeah, you can't do that.
And it seems like this idea of fairness also applies to how these decisions are explained.
Oh, absolutely. That's a key point.
Yeah.
When a claim is rejected because of credibility issues, the decision maker has to give clear and specific reasons. They can't just say, oh, we didn't find them believable.
Right.
Vague statements won't cut it.
Right. They need to actually articulate.
Exactly. They need to say, here's why we found the claimant's story unconvincing.
Wow. It's like being a teacher, right?
It is. It's about providing feedback.
Yeah, you can't just mark something wrong.
Right.
You have to say why it's wrong.
Exactly.
So the student can learn from their mistakes.
Yeah. And in this case, the claimant deserves a clear explanation so they can understand the decision and maybe even address those concerns.
That's a really good point. And this isn't just about legal technicalities.
It's about respect for the individual. They deserve to understand why their claim was rejected.
Right. Okay. So now we're moving beyond these legal abstractions, and we're starting to talk about the human side of these cases.
Exactly.
And the guide also talks about the need to consider the claimant's individual circumstances.
Oh, no, absolutely. They advocate for a really nuanced approach that takes into account things like trauma, age, cultural background, gender. We can't apply this one-size-fits-all standard to everyone.
So you're saying that what might seem like a red flag for one person could be totally understandable for another.
Exactly.
Depending on their background and experiences.
For instance, someone who has experienced severe trauma might struggle to remember details consistently.
Right.
or have a hard time expressing themselves clearly.
Yeah.
And the decision maker needs to be sensitive to that and not jump to conclusions.
Right. It's about recognizing that trauma can have a huge impact on how people communicate.
Absolutely.
And process information.
You're right.
And it's not always as simple as just telling a straightforward story.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, this brings us to another really important consideration.
Okay.
What about cases that involve multiple claimants?
Right.
Like families applying for refugee status together.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What happens if one person's story is seen as less credible? Does that mean the whole family's claim is automatically in trouble?
That's where things get tricky.
Yeah. You wouldn't want to punish family members just because one person is maybe embellishing their story.
Exactly. And the guide addresses this specifically in this section on joint and related claims.
Okay.
And it really cautions against these sweeping judgments that unfairly penalize family members just because one person's story might not be seen as credible.
So you can't assume guilt by association.
Exactly.
Just because people are related.
No, you have to look at each individual's claim and assess it on its own merits.
And they give some examples of this.
Yeah, they use several real-world examples. To illustrate this point, there's Hussein, where a decision was actually overturned because the wife's credibility was never really examined, even though her husband's claim had been rejected. And then there's Gutierrez, where someone was trying to use the fact that their relatives had already gotten refugee status, but the court clarified that while family connections are relevant, each claim still has to be judged on its own evidence.
So even within a family, everyone has their own story to tell.
Exactly.
And their own experiences that need to be considered.
You got it.
Okay. And then there's Yaboa, where the court said that the decision maker hadn't fully considered the husband's claim because his wife had already been granted refugee status.
Based on her testimony.
Right. So even if one family member's claim is accepted, that doesn't mean everyone else will get a free pass.
Right. It doesn't guarantee anything.
But it does suggest that their stories should be considered in relation to each other.
It's about finding that balance between individual assessments and recognizing the family dynamics.
Right. Okay. So it's all about fairness and avoiding generalizations.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about what actually makes a claimant's story seem credible or not. The guide mentions something called the materiality of contradictions.
The materiality of contradictions.
Yeah, have you heard of that?
I have not. What is that?
Basically, it means that for a contradiction to really damage someone's credibility, it has to be about something important to the case, something material.
So if there are like little inconsistencies, those shouldn't necessarily derail a whole claim.
Exactly. The guide cautions against getting too hung up on tiny details. What matters is the big picture. Do the core elements of the story hold up?
So it's kind of like the difference between a typo and a plot hole.
I like that analogy.
A typo might be annoying.
Yeah.
But it doesn't ruin the whole book. Now, speaking of details, what about when a claimant's testimony at the hearing doesn't quite match up with what they said earlier? Like maybe at the border or on official forms.
Yeah, how much weight do we give to those kinds of differences?
Yeah, how much weight is given to that?
That's a crucial question, and the guide goes deep on this in its section on BOC forms and declarations.
BOCs?
Yeah, it stands for basis of claim. And it's this detailed form where people lay out their story in writing.
So it's their first chance to formally...
Yeah, to explain why they're seeking protection.
Right, and the guide is saying that decision makers need to be really careful when they're comparing a claimant's testimony at the hearing to what they wrote on that form.
Yeah, remember, we're talking about people who have been through traumatic situations. They might be dealing with a new language. They might be confused by a complicated legal system.
It's a lot.
It is.
So their story might change slightly over time. But that doesn't automatically mean they're being dishonest.
Exactly. There could be totally valid explanations for those differences.
Okay, so the guide is really saying we need to give people a chance to explain any differences.
Right, to clarify what they meant.
And there's actually a case, Mojica Romo, where the court basically said that not all contradictions or omissions mean that someone isn't credible.
It's another reminder to look at the whole person and not just focus on minor inconsistencies.
Okay, so what about when a claimant's story just seems too far-fetched?
That's where things get interesting.
Yeah. Can they be rejected just because it doesn't sound believable?
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay.
But the guide makes it clear that implausibility findings can't just be based on gut feelings or speculation. They have to be rooted in evidence and logic.
So you can't just say, I don't buy it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need to have solid reasons.
Okay. And there's an example of this in a case called Selvarasu. The claimant explained that he got his passport through a bribe.
Okay.
But the decision maker didn't believe him.
Right.
And they started speculating about what he should have done instead.
Yeah, like he should have gone through the proper channels.
Right.
But that's not realistic.
Right. And the court said that that was unreasonable.
Exactly. You can't reject someone's claim based on what you think they should have done in a dangerous situation.
Right. Right. You have to judge them based on their actions, not on some hypothetical ideal.
You got it.
Now, what if someone's testimony is just all over the place?
Okay.
It's incoherent. It's vague. They just can't seem to get their story straight.
Yeah. Is that a problem?
Yeah. Is that an automatic red flag?
It can be, but the guide says to be careful about setting these unrealistic expectations.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to things like political or religious knowledge.
So you don't have to be a political expert.
Right.
To have a legitimate fear of persecution.
Exactly. There's a case, Yilmaz, where the court said the decision maker expected too much political knowledge from the claimant. And in another case, Ullah, they questioned whether the decision maker even understood the claimant's religion properly.
Wow.
And they said that the expectations for religious knowledge were unreasonable.
So not everyone has a PhD in political science or theology.
Exactly.
And that shouldn't be held against them when they're seeking protection.
Absolutely. Now, this next one's a bit tricky.
Okay.
Demeanor at the hearing.
Yeah, demeanor at the hearing. Does that even factor?
It does, but it's tricky.
Yeah, it seems so subjective.
It is, and it can be unfair.
Right.
The guide acknowledges that demeanor can be a factor, but it says to be super cautious.
Okay.
Because you have to think about things like stereotypes, cultural differences, and the fact that it's just really hard to judge someone based on how they appear in a stressful situation.
So just because someone's nervous, doesn't mean they're lying.
Exactly. There's a case, Chikachuk, where they actually criticized the decision maker for making negative assumptions about the claimant's confident demeanor.
Oh, wow. So even being too confident.
It can be misinterpreted.
Can be a problem.
Yeah. And the guide stresses that demeanor alone should rarely be the deciding factor.
Okay.
There usually need to be other, more concrete reasons to question someone's credibility.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that first impressions can be misleading.
Absolutely. Especially in a situation like this.
Right, right. Okay, so what about delays in claiming refugee protection?
Yeah, that's another common issue.
Does that raise red flags?
It can.
Okay.
But the guide clarifies that delays are not an automatic bar to getting protection.
Okay.
You have to look at the individual circumstances. Things like trauma, cultural barriers, lack of access to information, all those things can lead to delays.
So there might be legitimate reasons why someone didn't seek asylum right away.
Absolutely. Think about it. If you're fleeing danger, your first priority is survival. You might not even know your rights. Or you might be afraid to trust authorities in a new country.
It makes sense.
It takes time to process trauma, to gather information, to make that decision.
To make that huge decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's some cases that the guide refers to about this.
Yeah, like Manej,
okay,
where the decision maker was suspicious that these two young people, they were 17 and 14,
okay,
hadn't sought asylum in the first countries they landed in on their way to Canada.
Right.
But the court said, hey, it's not reasonable to expect teenagers to understand all the complexities of refugee law.
Right, they're just kids.
Exactly. And then in Zia, the court emphasized that things like cultural barriers or psychological issues can also influence when and how someone seeks protection.
So it's all about individualizing the assessment.
Absolutely.
And not just applying this rigid standard.
No two cases are the same.
Now, I'm curious about this next part.
Sure.
The guide mentions criminal and fraudulent activities in Canada as something that can be considered when you're assessing credibility.
Okay.
That sounds kind of controversial, don't you think?
Yeah, it can be a sensitive area.
Does that mean that if someone gets a speeding ticket?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The guide's clear that This is just one factor among many.
Okay.
And it's not an automatic disqualifier.
Right.
So it's about the nature of the offense.
Okay.
And how it relates to the overall credibility.
So like minor offenses.
Right.
Or things that might be linked to their persecution. Like if they used a fake ID to escape.
Exactly.
Those wouldn't necessarily undermine their credibility.
Right.
But if they're like engaging in serious criminal activity and they're claiming to be this law-abiding citizen.
Yeah, that would be a different story.
That's a different story.
Yeah.
So it's all about...
It's about seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, seeing if the pieces fit together.
Exactly.
Okay. And I imagine this is where a really nuanced understanding of someone's individual circumstances is really important.
Absolutely. It's not about making generalizations.
Okay.
It's about looking at each case individually.
So when we're talking about the evidence that's used to make a negative credibility finding, the guide talks about trustworthy evidence.
Right.
So what kind of evidence really holds up?
Well, documentary evidence is generally considered more reliable than just someone's word alone.
So we're talking about things like...
Yeah, things like official government documents, medical reports, news articles, things that can be independently verified.
So a doctor's report would be more persuasive?
Generally, yes. Than like a letter from a friend.
Right, okay. But even with document, the guide is saying that you have to be careful.
Oh, yeah, you can't just blindly accept any piece of paper.
Right.
You got to think about the source, the authenticity, and whether the document actually supports what the claimant is saying.
Okay. And they caution against relying too heavily on evidence that might be biased, like letters from family or friends.
Right. Those might be genuine, but they're not as objective.
Right. It's like the difference between a character witness and a forensic expert, right?
Yeah.
One is about personal opinion, and the other is about facts and analysis.
Exactly. And what about when there are questions about a document's authenticity?
Okay, yeah. What if it looks forged?
Right, like if it looks fake.
Or tampered with.
The guide says if there are serious concerns, the decision maker needs to get expert verification.
So they might call in a document specialist or something.
Exactly. They can't just be like, oh, this looks fishy.
Right.
They have to point out the specific problems.
Okay, so once again, it's about showing your work.
Right. Explaining your reasoning.
Being transparent.
Exactly.
Okay. Now we need to talk about no credible basis findings.
Yeah, this is where things get serious.
Yeah, I can sense that this is a big deal.
It is.
So what does it mean?
It means that the decision maker has basically said there's just no credible evidence to support the claim at all.
So it's not just that the story has holes.
Right.
It's that the whole thing seems made up.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow. And what are the consequences of that?
They're pretty serious.
Okay.
It means the claimant can't appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division.
Okay.
And there's no automatic stay of removal while they're trying to fight the decision.
So it can basically fast-track someone to deportation.
It can, yeah.
Wow. That's why the guide really stresses that this finding should only be made in the most extreme cases.
Yeah, when there's absolutely no doubt that the story is completely fabricated. They have to scrutinize every single piece of evidence.
Wow. So it's this really powerful tool
that
has to be used super responsibly.
Absolutely.
And carefully.
And even then, it's not the end of the story.
Okay.
The guide mentions a case, Sterling, where they emphasize that a no credible basis finding can still be challenged in court.
Okay.
It's not a shield from judicial review. So the courts will still look at those decisions really carefully and make sure they weren't made too easily.
Right.
Or without justification.
Okay, so there's a system of checks and balances.
Yeah, there's oversight.
To make sure these findings aren't being abused.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there's another category of claims
that
can also have some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah.
And those are the manifestly unfounded claims. So these are claims that are seen as clearly fraudulent.
Yeah, basically.
But even in those cases, it sounds like the guide is saying we need to make sure that there's a fair process.
Yeah, due process is crucial.
And that there's real evidence.
Absolutely. You can't just call something fraudulent without solid proof.
Right, so suspicion isn't enough.
No, you need concrete evidence.
Like what kinds of things?
Forged documents, made-up stories, clear intent to deceive.
Okay.
You need to be able to show that they're intentionally trying to mislead.
Right, so you need to be able to prove that there's an intent to deceive.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense because that protects people from being wrongly accused. Right.
Absolutely.
Based on limited information. Or maybe even bias.
Right. You need more than just a hunch.
Okay. So this brings me to another type of evidence that comes up a lot. Medical and psychological reports.
Yeah, those can be really important.
Especially in cases where someone is claiming they've experienced trauma or persecution. Those reports seem really crucial, right?
It can be very persuasive.
Okay. So how does the guide say that decision makers...
Well, they should approach these reports carefully, like any other evidence.
Right.
You shouldn't just automatically accept them as the absolute truth.
Sure.
You have to look at the experts' qualifications, the methods they used, and whether their conclusions actually make sense in light of all the other evidence.
So a report from, like, a well-known psychiatrist would carry more weight than...
Generally, yes. Right. But credentials aren't everything.
Right.
You also need to look at what the report actually says.
Okay. So you're saying they need to scrutinize the content.
Yeah. Is it based on objective observations?
Right.
Testing?
Yeah.
Or is it mostly just repeating what the claimant told them?
So if there's a report that talks about visible scars.
Right.
Or specific PTSD symptoms. That would be more persuasive.
Yeah, much more so.
Than one that just kind of rehashes the claimant's story.
Exactly. You want to see concrete signs and symptoms.
Right. And the guide actually talks about this. In a Supreme Court decision, Kinsasamy. And the court basically said that it's not realistic to expect medical professionals to have witnessed these events.
Yeah, they're not eyewitnesses. They're providing a professional opinion based on their assessment.
Okay, so it's about understanding the limits.
Yeah, the limitations of their expertise.
Of expert testimony, but also recognizing its value.
Exactly. And these reports can be incredibly valuable in supporting someone's testimony, especially when we're talking about trauma.
Yeah. So how can these reports?
Well, they can provide real insights into how trauma affects memory, concentration, emotional regulation. They can explain why someone might have trouble giving a perfectly consistent or detailed account of what happened.
So they can help explain those inconsistencies.
Yeah, they can help fill in the gaps and explain why someone might react emotionally in a certain way.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's about understanding the impact of trauma, not just seeing it as a legal problem.
And they actually give some examples.
They do.
Of how this works in real cases.
Yeah, like in Joseph.
Okay.
The court criticized the decision maker for not considering the claimant's PTSD diagnosis when they were evaluating her credibility. She had a hard time explaining her fear of persecution, but the report showed that her PTSD was likely affecting her ability to communicate.
Right. So the court was basically saying,
you can't ignore the trauma.
Yeah, he can't ignore the trauma. That's a good point.
It is.
That we're dealing with human beings here, not robots.
These are real people.
These are real people who've been through really tough experiences.
And those experiences shape how they interact with the world.
Right.
How they tell their stories, how they cope with stress.
Okay. Now, this brings us to something else I wanted to touch on. The guide has a whole section about the need for a gender-sensitive approach. So why is that so important?
Well, women fleeing persecution often face different forms of violence and oppression than men.
So we're talking about things like domestic abuse.
Yeah, sexual assault, forced marriage.
These are all things that are happening.
They're realities.
To women seeking asylum.
And they might come from cultures where women are expected to be submissive, to not speak up.
To stay silent.
To not question authority.
So all of that can make it even harder for them to share their experiences.
It can be incredibly difficult.
And the guide is saying that we need to be aware of these realities.
And not make assumptions about how women should act.
Right. Or what they should know.
Exactly. You can't hold a woman who's fleeing an abusive husband to the same standard as a man who's been politically active and speaking out against the government.
It's two different situations.
Their experiences, their knowledge, their ability to tell their stories. It's all going to be different.
And the guide actually gives some examples of this.
Yeah, there's Jones, where they found that the decision maker was way too critical of small differences between her written statement and her testimony at the hearing. And they didn't consider whether that might be because of trauma. And then in Montenegro, they criticized the decision maker for not recognizing that the woman might not know everything about her husband's political activities.
Okay.
Because in her culture, women weren't supposed to
question their husbands.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's about understanding the individual within their cultural context.
Exactly.
And recognizing that those cultural norms might be influencing their behavior.
Right, and their knowledge.
And this need for cultural sensitivity.
It's so important.
It goes beyond these big picture things.
Yeah, it goes beyond gender roles.
Like gender roles.
It's about how people communicate.
Okay.
Even things like eye contact or body language.
Well, that's interesting. So if someone avoids eye contact,
right,
they might not be trying to hide something.
They could just be following the norms of their culture.
Right.
And someone who hesitates to talk about a traumatic experience might be struggling to express themselves
in a way that feels appropriate.
Yeah, or safe.
So it's more than just words,
Physically.
Right? It's about nonverbal cues, cultural context, and understanding the individual.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, we have language barriers to consider.
Right, that adds another layer of complexity.
I mean, so many refugee hearings involve interpreters, right?
Most of them do.
So how do we make sure the communication is clear and accurate?
Well, the guide emphasizes the importance of using qualified interpreters who can accurately convey the nuances of both languages. Yeah. And it also encourages decision makers to be patient and give extra time for communication when there's an interpreter involved.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You can't just rush things.
No, you got to take your...
Because you have an interpreter there. Yeah. It takes time to make sure that everyone understands each other.
It's a delicate process.
Right.
And things can get lost in translation.
Even with a good interpreter.
Even with the best interpreter.
Right. So you have to be really careful.
Yeah, you got to double check.
Double check, make sure everyone's on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then another layer of complexity is mental health issues.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right. How might those affect someone's credibility?
Well, things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, they can all affect how someone communicates and how they present themselves.
So the guide is encouraging decision makers to be aware of these potential challenges.
Right.
And not to judge someone's credibility just based on their mental health symptoms.
Exactly.
Okay. So someone who's withdrawn and disengaged might not be trying to be evasive.
They might be struggling with depression.
Or someone who seems agitated or easily startled.
Right.
Might not be exaggerating their fears.
They could be having flashbacks or anxiety.
So it's about understanding the connection between mental health and credibility.
Yeah, that link is important.
And if they're not sure how it's affecting the testimony, then they should seek more information.
Exactly.
Okay, it all comes back to this idea that we're dealing with real people.
Absolutely.
With real lives and real stories.
Not just legal cases.
Right.
These are human stories.
Right, and that leads me to this question.
Okay.
In a system that has such high stakes, where people's lives are literally on the line.
It's a huge responsibility.
How do we balance the need for truth with the need for fairness and compassion?
That is the question.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's a tension that runs through our whole legal system.
And especially in refugee cases.
Absolutely. It's a tough one. It's a tough one, and it's something that we'll continue to grapple with as we look deeper into this guide.
Yeah. So stay tuned for part 3 of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Where we'll keep exploring these ideas.
It's going to be good.
Yeah. It is a balancing act, finding that truth,
Yeah.
But also remembering that people are vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And they might not always get it right.
Yeah, and recognizing that refugee claimants are real people with complex experiences.
Yeah.
And those experiences need to be heard and considered fairly and humanely.
And this guide, even though it's focused on this legal stuff, it reminds us that it's about finding that balance.
It is.
Between truth and compassion.
Right.
It's like a roadmap for how to handle this messy reality of human experience.
Yeah.
Inside this system that's trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, because truth is rarely black and white.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with things like trauma, cultural differences, and all the challenges of communicating across those differences.
Right. And that's where the guide's focus on context really stands out.
It's not just what someone says. It's about understanding their background, what they've been through, how that shapes their testimony.
Right. And it also stresses that decision makers have to really look at the evidence
carefully.
And base their decisions.
On logic and reason.
Yeah.
Not on assumptions.
Right, not on stereotypes.
Right.
So it's like recognizing that everyone has their own unique story.
Your own journey.
And we need to evaluate those stories on their own merit.
Exactly, not against some idea of what a credible refugee is supposed to be like.
Right, right. And it's also a reminder
Yeah.
that the search for truth shouldn't come at the expense of fairness and compassion and respect for the individual.
Absolutely.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive into this world of credibility assessment, what are some of the key things that you hope our listeners will take away from this?
I think the most important thing is remembering the power of context.
Definitely.
Every little detail, every inconsistency, any hesitation needs to be understood within the bigger picture of that person's life.
Right. Their experience.
Their culture, their background.
And we also need to remember that trauma
trauma's huge.
Can have a big impact on how people tell their stories.
It can affect memory, concentration, emotional expression.
Right.
It can make it hard for someone to give a perfectly clear account of what happened.
Yeah, so we all need to approach these stories with sensitivity.
Absolutely. With understanding.
Yeah.
Recognizing that the way someone tells their story might be just as important as the story itself.
And finally, we have to remember that these are real people.
With real lives.
With real lives.
That's it.
These are human stories.
Exactly.
Of survival and resilience and searching for safety and dignity.
Yeah, beautifully put.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through
You're welcome.
This incredibly insightful deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
I think it's given our listeners
I hope so.
a new perspective on this whole issue of credibility assessment.
And the balance between finding the truth and showing compassion.
Yeah. And a reminder that behind every legal case, there's a human story.
That's it. That's the heart of it.
Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world around you.